welcome to our fourth and final virtual date night in our Month of Love series.
Tonight we'll be talking about emotions.
Tonight we focused our meal on colorful and fibrous foods. We started with a bed of mixed greens with cooked farro and a blend of roasted vegetables, carrots, red onions, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts with pumpkin seeds, as well as a little bit of feta cheese and salmon.
Hi, I'm Michael Cantor, licensed professional counselor and counseling director at Anchored Mind.
And I'm Kristen Cantor, nutrition director and registered dietitian at Anchored Mind.
Whether we like it or not, emotions are part of every meaningful relationship. In fact, they are what makes relationships meaningful. We've learned a lot about emotions in our marriage. Before we dive into some examples, let's make sure we understand the difference between emotions and feelings and thoughts and what all these things are inside of our heads. Emotions are chemical reactions in our brain that come from the limbic system. They are often triggered when we have a need, when something is really valuable to us or really important to us, when we really care about something, and they are often expressed in the form of feelings, which are physical sensations in our bodies. For example, many of us, when we feel stressed, we'll feel tense in our shoulders, or our jaw might clench. If we're anxious, our palms might get sweaty, our heart might start to race. If we're angry, we may feel hot. If we're sad, we may feel a weight on our shoulders. If we're happy, we may feel lighter, and the list goes on. One of the most important things to remember about emotions is that more often than not, we do not choose them. They are internal experiences that reflect our external reality. When we intentionally practice communicating emotions in our intimate relationships, it acts as a form of protection. They are the glue for connection. When we don't prioritize intentionally communicating emotions, we risk disconnection. For Kristen and I, this was not something that just automatically came into practice. She represents, in many ways, the ultimate form of acceptance, but also rejection for me as a man. To share anything that might feel weak or vulnerable, it's scary.
Not being comfortable with my own emotions, wasn't comfortable necessarily, and maybe a safe person to invite you to share your emotions and feelings, and thus definitely made you feel rejected sometimes.
We can agree it's worth the risk, even if it leads to conflict. You're getting what you need to get out there. It's still promoting connection. And connection is the ultimate form of protection when it comes to intimate relationships.
When Michael and I first got married, it was much more natural and a little easier for him to express his feelings. He's going to grad school and being a therapist, obviously that comes to the territory. That was really uncomfortable for me. But I'm so thankful that he did, because it was such a good example. And he was willing to risk vulnerability and put himself out there. Leading by example helped me get more comfortable with those conversations and the benefit of sharing with one another.
Say how you feel versus show how you feel. Instead of working against it, we have to work with it and bring it into our relationships, because that's actually what connects us and keeps us safe. It's a common joke of therapists that we go to school and pursue our own training to fix ourselves and our families. And I'm not gonna lie, that was part of my motivation. I've certainly wanted to help other people, but I really wanted to understand what happened to my own family. I thought there was emotional expression, but it was more shown than said. Part of my story is my parents really struggled in their marriage, and as a result of that, my father took his own life. And so it was a launch pad for me to really dive into why do we feel what we feel, and how does it lead to what it leads to. When two people have strong emotions that are a reflection of both of them having a need or something being really important to them, of course there's going to be conflict. That's the very nature of it. Not only how we move through that is important, but what we communicate is important. Taking some time and identifying how we feel, what we need, If we don't, we're going to end up competing with information. Most couples have perpetual emotional conflict, and the topic just changes every fight.
You bring up a good point, because for some of us, the first step is really being able to identify them and figure out our needs, which for some people like me was the harder first step. And then getting comfortable with sharing those was the second step, and build an intimacy in that way. Instead, I just felt like I was consistently rejecting my own emotions because I didn't want to have them, and I didn't want to have those needs.
And I think that goes back to how you're wired and your birth order. So there's a lot of reasons that you prefer to meet your own needs and maybe not even worry about identifying how you feel.
Yeah. And that really wasn't a problem until it's a problem, right? It's not that it doesn't work. It's not that it's not fine. It's just it got in the way of us building an intimate relationship, and really was disconnecting for us because I wasn't able to share and lean in that way.
That was only half the problem. I thought I was emotionally intelligent, and I was not. Identifying how you feel, being aware of your own emotional patterns, your own perceptions. A lot of how we look at things comes from how we feel. And if we let our feelings dictate our perceptions, well, that can get us in a lot of trouble. And part of my issue early on was if I felt a certain way on the other side of her, like fear or frustration, that started to inform my perception of our marriage. And that's really dangerous territory.
I also really like that you brought up how we're wired is part of the equation, but it doesn't have to determine the result. I think that I'm an example of that, because I'm, part of my wiring is not to be that comfortable with sharing, emotional needs. But here we are, and I'm doing it, and it's gotten a lot easier for us since the beginning. And we have built a lot of emotional intimacy through those years of doing this and practicing it, and it doesn't feel awkward anymore. So.
The other side of that is me learning how to honor her wiring. Supporting her independence is part of showing her love. Otherwise, if I expect her to be overly dependent, it's essentially asking her to deny who she is. And that brings us to another point. We should not put our spouse in a position of being overly dependent on us or us being overly dependent on them. There should ideally be a balance where we fulfill our own emotional needs, and that could include outlets to de-stress. It can include our own interests, our friendships outside of the marriage, assuming they're supporting of the marriage. It could include family. The point is we should never allow anything outside the marriage to be more of a priority in getting our needs met than within the marriage. That is actually a threat to our intimacy. With emotions often being breadcrumbs to our needs or things that are really important to us, when that happens simultaneously in a relationship, it often leads to conflict. That can bring a whole other can of worms. If you, for example, didn't grow up in a family where you saw much conflict, or if conflict for whatever reason makes you feel uncomfortable, even you feeling uncomfortable may be something that creates a perception that there's something wrong with the relationship.
I was very uncomfortable with conflict when we first got married, and we had a lot of it. So that was really hard and a little bit scary for me, but it was also really good for us because we got a lot out on the table, we learned a lot, and we communicated, right? Which in the end brought us closer together rather than further apart. But now I think we have learned how to have healthy conflict with each other, and that has made it much safer communicating our needs. And even when we get really big emotions or feelings, we still communicate in a safer way than we used to.
Conflict is normal, and even though it feels scary or really hard, if we're going to have it, at least make it worth it. How do we make sure we're growing from this and learning more about each other in the midst of it being very difficult, or even making us question if this is the right relationship? Another deeper layer of emotion is what we believe about emotions. It's common for many people to have negative beliefs from their negative emotions. But if we don't challenge those beliefs, or at least question them, then they often can prove to be true and then reinforce more negative emotion. Obviously, this is complex. This is why I have a job. Therapy exists to help really unpack a lot of these layers. All emotions come from the same place. And Kristen talks about this with her nutrition. There are no good and bad emotions, just like there is no good and bad food. There are emotions we prefer to feel, and then there's emotions that we don't prefer to feel. But they all have good intent, they all have purpose, and when we can put them in the right context and identify why they're showing up, we have a little bit more understanding of why they're there, and we can choose how to respond instead of react. So emotions, in essence, should become a shared problem in the relationship. That again leads us to connection and promotes intimacy. What has been the most helpful to you as we've practiced communicating how we feel to each other?
Learning how to communicate my feelings without blaming you or pointing them at something or someone, and learning how to do kind of a soft startup and just explain how I feel. Getting more comfortable identifying emotions has helped with both communicating the negative ones and the positive ones.
Yeah. Specifically, sharing more of the positive moments and being intentional about that. It fills my tank, knowing that we're not waiting for the next negative emotion to be communicated or the next need that's lacking. Instead, we can also promote and celebrate the good things that are happening.
Do you or have you ever felt like physical effects from emotions or feelings, like without being necessarily able to identify them? Do you ever feel the symptoms of them first?
I think stress is one of the worst ones for me. I notice my breathing gets shallower or my posture starts to cave in.
I don't know that I would have been able to put that together, that I was feeling really hot with actually being able to say out loud that I was feeling angry or frustrated. That's how much I rejected my own emotion, probably. It's interesting to look back at those connections, and be able to identify the feeling faster now before those physical symptoms kick in.
It's so important to learn each other's tells, especially non-verbally. If I have like kind of a blank face, she knows I'm in my head trying to problem solve or analyze, and more often than not, there's at least a moment where she could check in and offer some support,
which does help bridge that gap a little bit sooner rather than waiting until it's a bigger thing to work through together. I didn't even like when he would ask me how I was feeling when we first got married. I didn't want that question.
The quintessential therapist question.
Yeah. How are you feeling? Yeah.
I do try to avoid it. Yeah. But it's a fantastic question.
And now it really feels like when we ask each other that and when we check in, that we just get closer together, which is really nice.
So when in doubt, ask that question. How are you feeling?
Even if the other person doesn't like it.
Yeah, there's other options. How can I support you today? Or going back to the temperament language, knowing your partner's needs, how can I fill in the blank? So in our first week, we talked about attachment, which is all about how we dance together, and it's informed by our early relationships. Our second week, we talked about our differences in nature, otherwise known as temperament. And that is how we're wired, how before even our personality develops, we are pre-assigned with strengths, weaknesses, and these innate needs that often inform how we feel. And then in the third week, we talked about communication and conflict, how to effectively communicate through moments of connection, but also moments of disconnection. Tonight, we really wanted to focus on, regardless of how you're wired, regardless of how you grew up, we must intentionally communicate our emotions in order to promote connection and then protect our intimate relationship.
Thanks for joining us in our Month of Love series. We really enjoyed it and we hope you have too. If you connected to it in any way at all, you're welcome to continue following along, or you can visit our website. We have nutrition counseling and mental health counseling and events available.
And if you have any feedback or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment or you can email us. We'd love to continue to offer content that is helpful.
Thanks.